Okay, so welcome everyone to
All right.
Gap Year Association's third Deeper Dialogue session with Robin Pendoli. And Robin, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Robin Pendoli. I was the founder and director of Thinking Beyond Borders for about 13 years. It was an international gap year program that provided programming for students to head all over the world and learn about social impact theory and practice. How do we make the world a better place? And I no longer work with Thinking Beyond Borders, but there are great gap year opportunities out there for both students interested in programs, students looking to have individual gap years. But I was asked to come and speak today about the transitions to and from gap years and why it's really important to be thinking about those transitions, because at the end of the day, it's not always easy to transition to and from gap years. And the more that we can think ahead and prepare for those transitions, the more successful our time on our gap years are going to be, and the more successful we're going to be in really benefiting from that investment of time and energy and sometimes resources in our gap years for years and years to come. So the first thing I wanted to do is just kind of give a quick context to why thinking ahead and preparing for a gap year is so important, beyond just thinking about what activities you'll be engaged in, where you might be, whether you're living at home, whether you're traveling domestically or abroad, whatever your activities are. There's some context that's worth keeping in mind. The first is that for all of us at this particular age, when we're 18, 19, 20 years old, which many gap year students are, they're not all, we're really in the middle of a big, what's called a developmental stage in our lives. This is what psychologists and educators and such talk about as a big developmental shift in our lives, where we go from really being part of our family, our local home community, to starting to emerge into adulthood and defining who we really want to be as adults. It's a really exciting time, but it's also a time that comes with enormous shifts, not only in what our day-to-day activities might look like, but how we see ourselves, how we engage with the world, and the types of decisions that we make for ourselves and others. It's a really important time to be learning about the world and to be learning about ourselves, and our brains do it naturally. The most important shift that happens in your brains, and we don't talk about this a lot when we're in classrooms often, but the most important change that happens in our brains at this part of our lives is that we start to develop that frontal lobe. It's kind of the last part of our brain that develops between the ages of like 18 to 25. And it's the part that lets us see things, the world, in much more dynamic ways. It's not just our brains generally before that were pretty good at saying this thing happens and that causes this thing. Our frontal lobes allow us to do something called metacognition. We get to see the world as a really complex system and how it all interacts together. And while that's really exciting because we get to see the world in new and different, more complex ways, it's also really hard because we suddenly realize that our relationships with lots of other people and other systems in the world are much more complicated than we originally thought. And that there's a lot to that. So let's hit pause on that for a moment. But that's one of the really important things about this period of life, why a gap year can be so important, why it's important to step out into the real world in some way or another. Even during these COVID times when stepping out into the world can sometimes be more digital than physical, but it's why stepping out of a classroom and into a more dynamic world can be so exciting at this moment in our lives when our brains are really ready to start thinking in new and different ways. The second is that we're transitioning, at least in our gap years, we're often transitioning out of more institutional time in schools or sometimes away from our home or our home communities into daily existence that we get to structure for ourselves, or that we get to really choose in a way that we might not have been able to choose our high school previously or our home environment previously. And that is a big change in our day-to-day. It's a big change in the responsibility that we hold for ourselves and our interactions, how we shape our relationships with other people. And then finally, the other big thing about this moment, this developmental moment in our lives, is that our relationships with our friends change pretty significantly, in the sense that our friends now really become the center of our world in a way that when we were much younger, our families were really the center of our world. We started with our parents being the most important, we might have had siblings, and then over time, our friends became more and more important parts of our lives. And for many of us, when we get to this developmental moment, around the time we take a gap year, our peers become really important parts of our lives, not just because they're friends or significant others, but also they become the most important people for us to sit down and process our thinking with and our emotions with, and how we see the world and why we see it that way. It's part of why living in a dorm in college and that traditional college experience can be so exciting, because you're surrounded by peers that not only do you have fun with, but you get to sit down and talk about really the deep and meaningful pieces of life. Naturally, our brains want to do that at that point in our lives. We want to engage with our peers in new and really exciting ways. So I share all that context to say it's really helpful to kind of keep our brains set on the reality of where we're at in our lives when we step into the gap year, because it can really help us understand what types of things we want to be prepared for as we head into our gap year, and then as we think about what it'll be like to finish our gap year as well and transition into the next phase of our lives. I'm actually going to pause there. We have some folks who are here present at the moment, and I'm curious if there are any comments, questions about kind of that initial context piece that I just shared.
I don't have a question per se, no. But I do have a sort of a comment about something that's come up in this time, and maybe we want to talk about it later, but there's been a lot of discussion recently about sort of a developmental delay that's happening because of COVID and because of the pandemic. So, you know, maybe as we go along in this conversation, I would be interested in addressing that a little bit from both a parent perspective and a program perspective, because I have children who may be considering, you know, way down the road a gap year, or I might be encouraging. But I feel like this pandemic has sort of upended everything, and where students are now may not be the same that students were sitting in who were considering a gap year, you know, 2 years ago. So it's come up in many conversations, and I think about it as a parent and also from the programming perspective of how programs might engage in that reality when they receive students now or participants. So.
Yeah. And in the chat, if you're watching the video in the chat, you may or may not have been able to see, but there were echoes of interest in that same topic. Emily, I'm curious if that was what you were going to share as well.
It was, yeah. It was just, I think we had a good number of groups and students out last fall, and kind of the things that we noticed is, you know, their goals particularly were that peer time. They'd missed that in these kind of pivotal moments at the end of their senior year. They weren't getting that traditional college dorm environment. And so they were like, I just want to be with my peers. And that for a lot of them took precedent over everything else. They're like, yeah, I'll do projects and I want to do all these things, but I want that time with my peers. And so I'm just curious, yeah, kind of is this kind of like a sufficient replacement? Like, are they getting that same, what they would do, you know, some freshman year of college from this experience? Or yeah, kind of like, are we seeing kind of that same thing, like a delay in some students where they've now missed almost a year maybe of those constant social peer times and what the effect that's having?
Well, Diana, did you have a thought as well?
Well, I'd just be curious to throw in the whole concept of the transition of shifting from a virtual world to an in-person world, and how peer relationships exist in a virtual world. I know many gap year students do have kind of virtual relationships with other students in terms of connecting around, you know, what to do on their gap year, or just the shared experience of having a gap year, and they're connecting either through their college has connected them saying, hey, there's 30 other students who are doing gap years just like you, or 100 other students who are doing gap years just like you, and putting them on a listserv together. So that was happening even pre-COVID times. And so building that relationship in kind of online, right? And then now there's also all these virtual programs, and students are building relationships that way, or high school, and they're continuing their friendships both in a virtual way and, in a masked way, but when they are in a limited way in person. So how is that affecting things when, what are we expecting to see when students are back transitioning from really these online friendships and relationships with teachers and things like that to more of in-person? So just throwing that into the mix.
Yeah, let's see. I'll share a few thoughts. And to be honest, I think the most important thing for anyone to know, whether it's parents, students, program providers, is that we don't really know, right? In many ways, at least in the US context, we haven't seen a global pandemic like this in 100 years. And so there's really there are not a whole lot of immediately available parallels. And even when it happened 100 years ago, we didn't have the digital world that we've been pushed into now. So I think that's the most important thing to recognize, is we don't know, and that should lead all of us, whether we're parents, students, or program providers, to ask questions, to dive in and figure out what questions are most relevant in this moment. How do we understand? How do we keep attuned to what needs might be? And then, as we move forward day to day within our experience in this, and then what tools can we bring to bear to be responsive to and supportive of students having successful gap years, success being hopefully measured in a number of different ways. One, primarily being healthy, physically and mentally. Two, that we're learning and growing in the ways that we want to. And three, hopefully finding real joy in the gap year experience as well. So I think this concern about, as an educator, and I'm now no longer working in the gap year space, but I am still working in the education space, the dialogue and the discourse about this question of what has the impact of COVID really been on students in their development, in their well-being and all that. There's a lot to read out there, and there's some good findings, early findings so far, that help us understand there are much higher levels of anxiety than we've ever seen before. There are higher levels of depression. There's higher levels of all of the mental health stuff that, not to be too scary, but was already a crisis on college campuses before COVID. That all of that was amplified during COVID, and that it was amplified in ways that were inequitable. That we're actually seeing, there's some studies that are showing that we're seeing more of it for students of color, for low-income students, because the barriers that are out there in society to gain support and to realize a healthy daily life in this moment are more real for students of color and for low-income students in America. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that some of the early reporting and analysis is showing that mental health support needs will be even higher than they had been before, and they were already quite high. The other thing that I would say, though, that I think is also important, and there's not as much out there in the research world and the education world about this, but some folks are really starting to talk about it, is that there's also a degree of resiliency that some students are really developing that they would not have had they not had this experience. That some students are really finding that COVID pushed them out of their comfort zone in ways that they hadn't experienced before, and that they've adjusted, and that adjustment process has helped them build some skills around resiliency. There are some students who struggled in the past in day-to-day experiences in school, who in COVID, in distance learning, are actually much happier. That they're finding that a distance learning environment is one that feels much more comfortable, that they actually see reduced anxiety for some students, that they see higher levels of productivity, that they're learning more than they would have in the classroom. So I offer that just to say that I think it's important for us, for students, for parents, for program providers, to not just assume it's all bad, but to really be curious about how each student has been affected by COVID in this. And the final thing I would say about developmental stages, and then maybe we can talk more specifically about what do we do? What do we do in our transition into our gap year and our transitions out? But I think the final thought that comes to mind for me in this is that we develop as humans. Our bodies are still developing. A lot of what we talk about in terms of developmental stages is what, again, psychologists and educators have been talking about for generations, is that this idea of developmental stages, when our brains develop new capacities for learning, for understanding, when our brains also develop new capacity for social engagement, that's continued through COVID. Not being in school, not having homeroom, not having, you know, the kinds of social engagement that we consider to be common for high school students doesn't stop that brain development from happening. It's still happening. It may happen in different ways. We may be developing different parts of those capacities in different ways than we would have previously, but our brains didn't stop developing because of COVID, and for our students or ourselves. So I think that's an important thing to be thinking about, is that I would challenge us to think a little bit differently about developmental delays and think about it more as different development, because the context is different, but we continue to develop. So let me share a few other thoughts, and then from there, particularly because of who's on the call right now with me, maybe we can dive a little bit more into discourse and discussion rather than just me talking at you, because there's a lot of expertise on the call as well, not just me by any means. As we think about transitions to and from gap years, whether you're going to be, you know, whether students or parents are looking at a program as an option, and independent gap year as an option, or, you know, as program providers, there's lots of details. In fact, before we started recording, Emily was talking about the program that she works for, and the detailed level of work that they're deep in right now as they prepare for spring programs to depart. There's lots of details to be thinking about. What I think is really important, and what our experience at Thinking Beyond Borders over 13 years showed us, was that while all of those details about the day-to-day operations of your gap year, where you're going to be, where you're going to sleep, what you're going to eat, what you're going to do, all of those things, those can be really consuming. What is really important to not forget is that you're coming into, as a student, you're coming into your gap year as a full human with personal needs, with a personal history, and that you want to make sure that your gap year is not just going to meet those essentials. It's not just going to have exciting new opportunities, but that it's also going to have a support system in place if and when you need it. That can look like a few different things, right? Sometimes it looks like daily self-care. Do you have time to exercise and have physical activity in a way that you normally would built into your schedule? Do you have time set aside for regular meals? Do you have regular meals some way structured in terms of, if you're feeding yourself, when are you going to go and get that food, and where's the money going to come from for that food? Where is that food going to come from that's going to make sure that you have a balanced diet that's healthy? Those types of daily self-care things are really important. But also thinking about, are there parts of your current daily routine or parts of your routine previously that have been really helpful for you in managing stress, anxiety, just the daily ups and downs of life? How do you build those things in? For me personally, in times of high stress, and for me during COVID, it's been a period of, like for many of us, it's been a period of really high anxiety for me. I've built in running every day. It's really inconvenient for my schedule. I run every day. And it makes a huge difference for me. Simply to make it makes sure that I'm outside. Even if it's just 25 minutes, like it gets me out the door, it gets my body moving in a different way, and it's like a meditation for me. So real intentional planning, as you're thinking about planning out your gap year, whether you're in a program or not, but real intentional planning about what your daily self-care will look like is really important. 2 is to think about what your mental health needs have been in the past and what they'll be during the program and after. one of the, I'll share before we leave, but I've written some blog posts on Psychology Today over the years about mental well-being, mental health. And one of the things that I really truly believe is that we all have mental health issues. All of us, we all have needs. We all need supports at different times, particularly during periods of big changes in our lives where our bodies, our brains are changing a lot, like this developmental stage. And when the context of our life changes, when we're leaving school, traditional school institutions, or we're traveling, or we're in a new social environment. And so thinking about what things you need specifically for mental health supports on a day-to-day basis, that may be journaling, that may be checking in with a specific friend on a regular basis, or a parent on a regular basis, or a mentor. But also then thinking about what's going to happen if and when your needs get elevated. If you start to feel real stress, if you start to feel real anxiety, if a more acute, well-being issue that you've had in the past, that might be eating issues, it might be self-harm, it might be all kinds of things, depression. If those start to become elevated, what will you do? If you're at home in your home community, some of those resources may still be there, but you want to make sure that they didn't go away if they were tied to your day-to-day experience in high school. Who will be those touch points for you? If you have a therapist but you're traveling, will you be able to be in touch by phone or by Zoom? If you use medication on a daily basis or just when needed, will you make sure that there's a sufficient supply that's available for you throughout the program? A gap year is not a time to make big changes around self-care with medicine or any type of significant support. You want those things to be in place, even if you don't end up needing them. The final thing is that it's really important to have a crisis plan in place in case there is a real problem down the road for you. The truth of the matter is it's really easy to get excited about a gap year. I get to get away from the stress of high school. I get to get away from the stress of, if I'm traveling, or simply just stepping away from the day-to-day grind of what school can sometimes feel like into more exciting. It can be really easy to think about this idyllic experience that your gap year is going to be traveling with friends, or engaged in this new work and this other exciting stuff, or deep in your art, or whatever it may be. It's really easy to get excited about that and miss the fact that it will by definition come with some periods of stress. It will come with some periods of anxiety. And that if there are things you've really struggled with in the past, there's a good chance that over the course of a semester or a year, doing new and different things in new and different environments, there's a good chance that those things may pop up again. And so having a crisis plan in place, particularly if you're an individual, but even if you're in a program, having a crisis plan in place is essential. If you're an individual, that means knowing what signs you're looking for in yourself and when to ask for help and who you're going to ask. If you're in a program, I cannot stress enough how important it is to disclose any history of anything you've experienced with program leaders, either before you depart for your program or in the very first days of your program, because they're there to help. That's what they're there for, your program leaders and the program support folks at home. If you wait until you're in a moment of crisis to start to build out a plan of what you're going to do, it's going to be too late to put a plan in place that is really effective and can help you stay on track for your gap year in the way that you want to be. At that point, it's going to be, how do I get away from the gap year work that I've been doing and the gap year plan that I had into something that's completely different? And that's hard. That's not the way you want to go. If you have a crisis plan in place, our experience over more than a decade was that the crisis plan, if it was put in place in a time when you didn't need it yet, the crisis plan often worked. And we were able to help students have really successful experiences and stay in their gap year, stay with their original gap year plan. So all of that was said in the context of transitioning into your gap year. Planning ahead, thinking about what your needs might be, and how those needs will be met during the course of your gap year. The only thing that I'm going to leave with, and then we can move into more conversation from here, is just to say that the transition out of your gap year sometimes can be harder than the transition into. Particularly if you've traveled, it can be really hard to come home. As much as we talk about culture shock in the international education world, oftentimes the hardest culture shock is when you come home, particularly if you've been abroad for a significant amount of time. And so considering all those same things I just talked about in terms of planning ahead for self-care, planning ahead for what it will be like to be in your gap year, it'll be really important to plan for what being out of your gap year will look like as well, because oftentimes it's another period of transition before you start school or you start work or you start some next period of your life. And it can feel just as much like the rug has been pulled out from underneath you, and that solid foundation of a day-to-day experience can be pulled out from underneath you as it did when you started your gap year. So if there's anything I can offer, it's plan ahead. Take a moment to think about what the worst case scenario is and plan backwards for what it would take to ensure that you don't get to that point of really struggling with something that is either new or something that you've experienced in the past that might pop up again. So I'm going to pause there. I have more I could say, but I feel like I'd rather have conversation with you all on the call than do that. I think it might be a bit more interesting. But I'm curious if there are thoughts, reflections from those of you who are here, from your experiences in programs as students, from your experiences as program providers, or if there are questions.
I was definitely thinking, I think from my experience leading and then now as a program provider side, I think the conversations about return, culture shock, coming back to your own country after traveling. I think one of the things that we're looking at is from people coming off of even a domestic program and returning. So how do we get them to, it's not reentry shock in the traditional sense of coming back from spending a semester in India to back to the US, but it's like return to your old life culture shock, and getting students, I think, providing the right resources, but also getting students to take that transition seriously. I think they often think, oh, like I've just been in California for this long, or I've been traveling some, but I'm just going home. It's not that big of a deal. And what kind of resources or what kind of ways to prep those students for, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really probably will still be significant.
And
yeah, and you know, yeah, please.
I was just going to say, I think something we often forget is that sometimes it doesn't matter where you're traveling to if you're on a program. So for students who are partaking in experiential education programs, whether they're gap year programs, summer programs, study abroad programs, whatever it is, if it's a really great program, it means that the group is the central focus. And so students are often have never been in experiences where they've gotten to know people on such a deep level and been such a pod. Like this concept of a pod has been around for a long time with experiential education, but now everybody's experiencing it with COVID, right? Like we're all in our own little pods within our homes. And so there's really the reentry process is actually an exit from being with all of those people, and kind of like that feeling of your left arm, your right arm, your legs being cut off because suddenly they're not there. Those people who have been in your space 24/7 for the last 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever, however long it's been, they've been the culture that you've been experienced, as well as moving through whatever the new landscape or culture you might be experiencing on in terms of the experiences you're having on your program. But it's oftentimes, again, back to those relationships and being in that intentional group that I think is the hardest transition for students when they're coming out of their gap year, to not being able to have that group anymore.
I think that's right. I think the other thing that we found at over the years of Thinking Beyond Borders was that students would oftentimes spend a lot of their time abroad with a vision of how great it's going to be to go home at some point. The comfort of home, how familiar it's all going to be, and then they get home and realize home is not all that familiar anymore. And that what we found, one of the things that we found that helped was helping students frame why that was true, which is that home doesn't feel unfamiliar because home has changed. Home actually is by and large the same home you left. What changed was you. Like, you had these experiences where you intentionally or unintentionally asked big questions about who am I? What is this world? What are my values? How do I want to live those things? And you did that often, sometimes at least in our programs, you did that as part of a pod. And so you had a bunch of people who went through this transformational experience together. You kind of created this feeling like they all understand what I'm going through, so we're all together. And then suddenly you go home, and not only do you have, as you're pointing out, Diana, that group that gets where you're at, the transition process you're going through, now you're alone and you're at home in this place that you thought you were going to step off the plane, step out of the car and come into this comfortable, warm space that's so familiar. And suddenly you see it through entirely new eyes, and it doesn't feel comfortable anymore. You have to make new sense of it and build a new relationship with it because you're different than you were when you left. And that process, as we used to say, that thinking beyond border students, that's a process that takes years to rebuild that relationship. It's what you decided you put in your closet. It's what you decided was going to be in the refrigerator, to the degree that you had that power in your own home. You know, it's how you relate to your friends and what things you want from your friends and how you want to engage with them. And it's thousands and thousands of little decisions, moment to moment, that you kind of have to remake over the course of years. It isn't just if you've had a really transformational experience. And so that helping to frame that for students and helping them think ahead on that, we found was really helpful. And then checking in with students over time after they returned home, kind of in, as they're getting ready to head off to a fall semester, if that's where they're heading, as they're getting ready to head back for a spring semester, of their first year of college. Those we found were really important times to check in and help them kind of get back in touch with where they were, so that they know that learning and growth in their gap year was a real thing. It wasn't just imagined, but also to help give some perspective on where they're at in the process and what resources are out there to help them. And for individual students, sorry, one last thought. For individual students, so many college campuses these days have resources and groups that are specifically designed for gap year students. Those have been really important support groups for gap year alumni to tap into, to find other students who, at least in some ways, share some parallel experiences in that and to provide community and support in that way. Does any of that resonate with you all? Other thoughts, other questions about that, or what we want to share earlier?
A lot of it definitely does, both on a personal level and a professional level. But I also think highlighting again, like those changes that you go through, and then when you come home after an experience, kind of thinking that, okay, I'm just going to come back home to my old life. But the old life too will have moved along, like those friendship dynamics and those relationships, they change a lot too. And so when you get back, and that adjustment can be hard when you return from something and you find that your friends and that dynamic that you shared with maybe an intimate group before may not exist, or it may exist in a different level or a different capacity or a different, just a different way to kind of nurture each other's needs. That's something, I know students I've worked with have experienced a lot, as well as me personally, when I spent time abroad and then came back home and found, oh, my relationship and dynamics I have are different. So it's important and helpful to think about that and work with students on that if it's possible.
Robin, going back to students. Oh, go ahead, Amanda, go ahead.
No, one of the things that I keep coming back to is like thinking through reentry and how like supporting students years after their experience. There is that like acute kind of phase right after they get home, but then I've seen students come to me, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, even later, and talk about how they're still processing things and they're still processing that experience. And it actually makes me think of something that you had said earlier on that resilience piece, and specifically, the students who are going through it now, and how is this COVID period going to impact them 2 years, 3 years, 5 years later. I just keep coming back to that. And I'm curious too of like, your thoughts on how to support students in articulating that and talking about that resilience piece, because they're going through it right now. But I always find that, like, 5 years from now, if I'm talking to students who I've worked with years in the past, I'm reminding them of, like, remember how resilient you were, or remember you actually went through that experience, but they forget after a certain point of time, or they're so in it and right now. And I feel like too, this experience that they're going through right now could be another year, 2, 3 years that this is going on in the world. Who knows? So I'm curious too if anyone's figured that piece of the puzzle out, or at least just sort of thought through of, like, what can we be doing right now, and what can students be doing right now to really embrace that resilience, but also be able to explain it to themselves, and to other people and their families and communities.
One tool that I've learned through experiential education programming, that I still use and I think is really valuable for students, is writing a letter to themselves. Writing right now how they're feeling, how they're developing resilience, what their experiences are on their gap years or during COVID in general. Writing it for 6 months out, 3 months out, and also 5 years out. I just jumped around the calendar, but kind of where we're all at. But letter writing is a really great tool.
One of the things we made a big investment in doing was in what reentry looked like. We kind of rethought it in a way that was fairly unique in not just gap year, but in study abroad. Of every program, particularly the 2-semester programs, ended with a 10 to 12-day retreat, where it was really a structured reflection time on what did we just do? Who am I? What changed? And that they actually had to build out a formal presentation of how they were going to articulate at least some component of what they're finding in that reflection to family and friends. And so, that in thinking about, Amanda, your question, I wonder if there isn't something to be said for, particularly for students coming into programs right now, creating some intentional and ongoing structured reflection on what have we just been through, and how do we process it? I would also say, we've talked about it so far in this call as this period of COVID, but I think a lot of students have felt the anxiety of the political moment we've been in as well, and that no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, it's been a high anxiety period that for some students has really touched on how they see themselves, how they interact with their families, and how they interact with their communities and the country in general. And so, creating some space for some processing of that, I think, Amanda, I think that's right. And I think it needs to be intentional processing. And to some degree, that processing should result in the ability to articulate to yourself and to others what you're taking away from that, like what the challenging parts were, how you've grown, and some consciousness about what the process was that got you to that growth. Emily, I saw you were going to interject a minute ago before
I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. I think it was like the idea of having something concrete to return to, whether it's a letter to self, your journal, obviously TBB, that the presentation of learning, some piece that you could actually go back and read or rewatch, or something that will put you back in potentially the headspace you were in at the end of that program, and like, oh, right. Like that's what I was doing. That's what I was learning. That's what I was thinking then. And I don't know if they ever, like early on in the shutdown last spring, I did happen to do both of my TBB groups and, separately, did like a big Zoom call, and everybody checked in, and it was cool to see, 4 or 5, some of those were almost 6 years down the line, what I guess maybe they weren't noticing it, but we were seeing it as program leaders, what that learning was, and seeing a student connect something, even again, 5 years down the line, something clicked for them. And John W., in particular, one of my male students in my first year, and it took him 5 years, but he got there. And some of that stuff we talked about, and I would love if he still had, have him go back, or even go back and look at those things that he created or wrote back then. And so that to like guide him to that. Like, look, I see how much you learned. I see that it took time. That's okay. I want you to see it. And so I think having those concrete things is really helpful. Like, go back and look at that journal, John. Go back and look at that project, Sarah, whatever. And you can see the growth you've had and how you've incorporated that resiliency and everything you've learned.
Yeah, I think that's so spot on. And it really makes me think too, that like reminding myself that students necessarily don't have to articulate it, you know, right at the point where they get home, of like supporting them and giving them that piece of knowledge that if you don't know how it's affecting you, it's okay. And that even reassurance of it's going to be okay. You know, you don't know what you don't know what this is going to mean to you in a year, in 5 years. And that could change, you know, daily. So I really appreciate your thoughts. I think it's spot on for me.
What other thoughts come to mind?
I'm just thinking about going back to the planning or the going into the gap year and the plan that you talked about, Robin, and thinking about who to incorporate in that planning conversation and how to make sure that plan is actually going to be possible. And I see so much now, like all these online organization tools and people who do get into very rigid schedules. And I've had students myself where they come onto a program and they're planning to run every morning, and that's just not feasible on the program. Or you are traveling in a destination where it is really hot and it is actually too dangerous to go for a long run at 4 o'clock in the afternoon every day, because that is when it is so hot. Or, you know, I use running because that's such a common thing that you can do anywhere. You don't need to join a gym. You don't, you know, it's such an opportunity that a lot of travelers take on, I think, is running as a way to stay healthy. And so how to incorporate, whether it be a program or a host, if you are traveling independently, or you're, you know, not every student travels on their gap year too. So if you're whatever the experiences are that you're cobbling together to create this arc of a year for yourself, or you know, a 2-month period, or however long your gap year is, you know, who do you need? It's not just important to plan, but it's also important to figure out who do you need to contact to make sure that that plan is going to be possible. I'm also thinking about students with dietary restrictions. You know, if you are gluten-free is so common now. And so how are you going to make sure that you can, you know, meet those dietary restrictions? And just like in the simple, I think of it as the Maslow hierarchy of needs in terms of like food, health, shelter, and of course, well-being is up there too. You know, how can we, you know, how do we know how to identify the folks that need to be part of that planning process, and how to reach out to make sure that your plan can be successful? And also, and I think a lot of gap year alums talk about resiliency. They also talk about going with the flow and being flexible to change your plan, and like you know, a plan maybe is a preference of how you hope the day-to-day will go or something like that, but it's not necessarily the plan. And being flexible with changes that might have to happen.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, for students that are planning to engage programs, the program providers are your partners in this, right? Like that's a big part of what they're there to do. And so reaching out before the program to be really clear about what opportunities will be there and what won't. Reaching out to program leaders and setting your self-care plan and having explicit conversations as you start the program with program leaders and one-on-one and in group settings, and really kind of level setting about what's possible. And so I think that they're your primary partners in that. For individual students, it's part of the reason why gap year advisors, consultants that really have a clear understanding of what a gap year is and what the experience is, they can be key partners in that. They can help you really anticipate challenges and identify solutions. They also can help you connect with folks locally, wherever you may be, whether you're in your home community doing something you've never done before, or you're abroad or in a different community and doing some, you know, being somewhere you've never been. They can help you make those kinds of connections to folks that can really be great resources. I think that flexibility matters, and I think that desire, you know, as part of that developmental moment is we want to be adults. We want to be independent. And so I think that comes with it. I think that's really healthy, but it comes with two things that I think are really important if we want to be healthy. One is it comes with the need to be flexible. Just because you're independent and you really want to do things the way you want to do them, that's not a reason to say, I'm just going to push through whatever anybody else's plans are, or whatever any other reality is, and I'm going to do what I think is right for me. I'll give you a quick example, because we've been talking about running as a self-care tool. We had female students who were really frustrated that they couldn't run when they were in rural communities in tropical climates where it was really hot, that they couldn't run in shorts. It wasn't culturally appropriate. It wasn't respectful to the community. Is there gender equity conversation to be had there? 100%. 100%. But to be able to say, well, this is part of my self-care, and so I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care how it impacts the community, the program's relationship with the community, the host organization within that community's relationship with the community. That lack of flexibility and willingness to engage in the tough learning of that reality is important. So flexibility matters there. The other thing that comes with that I think is important about accepting and stepping into that adult's independent decision making is recognizing when you need help and how to ask for it. I will say being part of a program is not a guarantee that you're going to be safe and healthy, no matter how good the program is. And I'm going to say this with seriousness in my tone, because it is really important, and there can be real consequences for it. The biggest challenges we face that's Thinking Beyond Borders in keeping students safe and healthy, and we face some very big challenges. The biggest challenges we faced over and over again were with parents and students that conceal the history of a significant challenge from us. Mental health, physical health, all kinds of different forms of well-being that they said, either A, I don't trust you enough to tell you as a program provider, or B, it's in the past, it's never coming back, I'm not even going to tell you about it. That mentality is incredibly dangerous. If you're in a program, if you're going to step into a program and you want to be safe and healthy, you have to trust your program providers. You have to tell them up front so you all can make a plan in case it becomes a problem again. Because as I mentioned, it's a high stress period, whether you're on the gap year or at college or at home. It's a high stress period. And waiting until there's a crisis is too late. No program can be prepared for your crisis if they don't know that the crisis is coming. So that's all of it for programs. For individuals, again, I think it's about identifying ahead of time who your resources are going to be and who to reach out to. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I just wanted to mainly
share. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to make sure that was brought up, because I think it is, so many times we talk about gap year students taking the initiative themselves to do everything. And a lot of students don't work with counselors. A lot of students do just find a program and then they apply and they have one conversation with the program and then they jump on the program. And so they might be doing this planning on their own. And especially since we drive so much conversation around this being a time to go out there on your own, take responsibility for yourself and all these things. But it is so important to still make sure that you're incorporating and involving the support systems around you in the planning process, not just in the times when you get back or in the times during the experience, but in the planning process. So I just wanted to really highlight that. Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I've never been a huge fan of independent gap years. and here's what I mean by that, is that as an educator, one of the things I really believe to be true is that learning is a social process. It's not something we do by ourselves. We do it with peers. We do it with mentors. We do it with folks that are engaged in engaging with the world with us and exploring the world with us. It's not something we do by ourselves. So if our goal is in our gap years to learn and grow, then we have to be planning to engage with other people. And so I think that's important, and we have to plan to do that intentionally. It's not going to happen by mistake. And so I'm not opposed to people going out and doing something independently, But I do challenge students and parents, if they're planning to do an independent gap year, to make sure that in planning, you're planning realistically around what relationships are going to be available to you and what relationships are going to be harder to form, that are going to make sure that it is a successful learning and growth experience, which is ultimately why most folks come to the gap year anyway, right? I think a lot of times we really idealize this idea of, I'm going to go somewhere and I'll get engaged with this internship or this organization or, in this community, and somebody's going to automatically serve as a mentor because I'm deserving of mentorship. Mentorship is hard. It's a hard thing to do well. It takes time and energy, and frankly, there's not a whole lot of people in the world that are sitting around twiddling their thumbs wishing they could find a mentee. Like, they've got other things to do. And so, thinking seriously, if you're doing an independent gap year in terms of planning it yourself, just making sure that you're planning realistically around who really is going to be a mentor to me. Like, who's going to be bought in, who's going to put the amount of time and energy and intentionality into supporting me in the ways that I'm going to need to be supported if I want to learn and grow. My biggest concern is that I would hate for somebody to take a gap year and come back and say, the biggest learning and growth I had was that I survived something that was really difficult. Kind of like, you should be challenged during your gap year, but it shouldn't, the biggest learning and growth shouldn't be, it was miserable and I had to figure out how to survive. That's just, we got to set the bar higher than that,
Well, we are at the top of the hour. Does anyone have any other questions or topics for Robin?
Can I pipe in, Robin? It's Catherine Stevader.
Oh, hi. How are you?
How are you? I look disgusting, so I'm not going to put my face on. I could put my face on, but I guess I probably should. Okay, there we go. So I just popped in at the end. It's so great to see you, and I'm so sorry I missed this piece today. I had a crazy client, and I just had the nicest conversation with some woman that works in a ranch in Wyoming, and she wouldn't let me get off the phone. So anyway, I'm working. But I love the fact that you just mentioned mentoring, because that has been one of the biggest parts of my business right now. As a mother of 4 kids, I see how much, especially my own high school kids need during this crazy COVID time. Checking in with them, how are they okay? But I've taken all of my 24 years of being a mother and really mentoring my students. And I'm that person to them that's not their parent, that's not their therapist, that's not their teacher, but I am someone who they can feel accountable to. And to me, I love the fact that you said that, because that makes my work seem, okay, well, if Robin's going to say that, then it makes my work feel like, this is really working. Because the kids are calling me, talking to me. It's been like my aha moment over the past couple of years. And I think now more than ever, that service, can I tell you, it takes hours and hours and hours and hours. But that is probably one of the best gifts I give to my students. So thank you for making my job even better.
I'm going to share it in the chat before we're done here. This is a link to a blog column that I used to write for in Psychology Today that includes topics like the transition to college, gap years, mentorship, all of those things. Some of it is stuff I've written. Some of it is stuff that colleagues have written. There's not a lot there, but hopefully a good resource just to jog people's thinking. The most important thing is, if you're planning to engage in a program, planning to work with a consultant, planning independently, there are great experts out there who have a wealth of experience, and trust them. Listen to them, learn as much as you can, be as intentional as possible if you're an independent student about planning your gap year, because the more planning you do to ensure it's going to be a safe and healthy one and a productive one for you, the more it'll pay off. Just because it'll help you think out how to make it a really successful time. But thank you to Diana and the Gap Year Association for having me. It's a pleasure to chat with all of you. And I look forward to learning more along with you as the deeper dives continue.
Thank you, Robin, for joining us this evening. I'm going to stop recording now.